Welcome back to the Sherry Sylvester Show. It's been almost a year since the October 7th attacks on Israel, and I wanted to invite our friend, Rabbi Dan Ain, to return to the show and discuss what he sees happening in Texas, America, and the world, since we talked shortly following the attack last year. Rabbi Dan Ain is the founder of Moontower Minyan in Austin. Together with his wife, writer Alana Joblin Ain, they seek holiness through facilitating honest conversation, promoting tradition and ritual, and creating space where people can speak freely and exchange challenging ideas within the context of Judaism. After his ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, Rabbi Ain served as rabbi of the New Shul in Manhattan and was director of tradition and innovation at New York's 92nd Street Y. He founded the Brooklyn-based organization Because Jewish and served as senior rabbi of Congregation Beth Shalom in San Francisco from 2018 to 2022 when he relocated to Austin. There's so many things I want to ask you about, but here's what's at top of mind for me. The last 72 hours have been monumental in so many ways. What are you thinking about the view of the Jewish community and the state of the world community right now?
I think it's been an amazing thing to see the systematic elimination of some of the worst terrorists in the world, to see the Prime Minister Netanyahu take out Nasrallah, take out the enemies who have been indiscriminately sending missiles into Israel, who have, since October 8th, Hezbollah was sending missiles into the northern part of Israel. 60,000 Israelis up north have been displaced. And I think there has been this ongoing conversation, and especially as we reach the Jewish New Year, this ongoing conversation about how do we achieve a level of peace in this world? How do we get back to security? Should we continue dialogue? We've been trying to pursue that as a Jewish community. We've had factions that are trying to sort it out. You have a whole bunch of people who've been meeting in Tel Aviv opposing Benjamin Netanyahu, and this has been going on for over a year. And yet, I think there's something so staggering about a military victory like we've seen over the past week. And it has shown, I think, the strength, the technology, and the resolve that sits at the heart of the Jewish people and the people of Israel. That's given us a lot of pride. You know, I wasn't born back in 1967 during the Six-Day War, but I know in light of the Six-Day War in 1967, Jews from around the world felt a pride about what it meant to be a Jew, as opposed to normally being afraid or being fearful, this idea that we could stick our chest out and defend ourselves. And I think we're getting a flavor of that after what has been a challenging and, for the most part, demoralizing year. As you mentioned, we spoke recently after October 7th, and Jews in Texas and around the country have been subjected to anti-Semitic attacks. I know that there are teens that I deal with who have to deal with rudeness, unkindness in school settings and online and in colleges and in universities, having to defend themselves, having to defend the state of Israel, issues that they might not even have expertise about, but all of a sudden being called to account for what often are lies or misunderstandings or just simply propaganda. And so I think the past week we have been able to, we don't take joy. It's the high holidays, and we definitely want to avoid, I think, taking joy in death. But it is something miraculous when you see a group of people whose goal is the destruction of my people, actually perhaps getting justice returned back to them.
And it's what we saw right after October 7th, the same kind of lack of information, lack of context. I mean, why is this even controversial? Jared Kushner tweeted that in the past 6 weeks, Israel has eliminated more people on our terrorist watch list than the U.S. has eliminated in 20 years. I think people do not know Nasrallah It was the guy behind the Beirut bombing
That's right.
of the 241 Marines. People don't get it's not just Jews that they're after. That's a bad enough goal. But these are murderous terrorists.
I have the chills as you're asking me this question because it has been shocking. It's been shocking to us to see people who have been flying Hezbollah flags, flying Hamas flags, flying terrorist flags, using words that have been traditionally harmful to the Jewish people and doing it in such a way that decontextualize exactly what has gone on over the past 75 years, decontextualize without understanding Iran's role in this, what Hezbollah has done over the past 40 years, what Nasrallah has been guilty of. Taking October 7th and just putting that aside because it doesn't help make an argument that they want to make. It's been shocking to some of us in the Jewish community. We've been struggling to understand why are people so voracious for some of these really negative images and stereotypes of the Jewish people. And we've unfortunately had to do a lot of soul searching over the past year. And the Jews that I talked to here in Texas have understood that perhaps some of the allies that they had supported, stood with, marched with previously, ultimately weren't allies that were going to stand with them. And this has been very sad, but on the other hand, it has been in a large part reinvigorating to people's individual Judaism. And I've been meeting with people more and more who say, since October 7th, I understand what my grandparents said. I understand what my parents said. I understand more now what it means to be a Jew, and I feel more compelled to go to high holiday services or to be a part of the Jewish community or to support the state of Israel.
So the first thing that President Biden, who is still our president, said and echoed Vice President Harris is ceasefire. And so what did you hear when that gets said? I mean, ceasefire is not a bad word. We all love the word ceasefire.
Well, we all want peace. Yeah. And I think the tension that has existed at the heart of the Jewish people, and it still exists. I was at a Shabbat dinner this past Friday night in which one party was gloating over what had been happening, and another party, a Jewish gentleman, had been a peacenik and didn't appreciate the gloating. And wanted to find a way to say, hey, has violence ever gone about achieving peace? And so there's that tension, which is we want a ceasefire, but the hostages are still hostages. And it's been almost 365 days of the hostages not being returned. If we wanted a ceasefire, they could return the hostages and we could have a ceasefire. And it's been disturbing to see I guess Americans who use hostages that were taken from their homes. I'm not over that. I know it's been a year, but I'm not quite over that. People who were taken out of their homes, out of a music festival, taken into tunnels, kept in unspeakable circumstances. And then you have people on certain campuses or in certain areas saying, well, those hostages are a part of, well, I guess that you're now think it's okay to use hostages in the negotiation process. Like that's the side that a lot of people are choosing to identify with. And it's jarring. It has been jarring to us as Jews. And maybe we did live in a little bit of a bubble. For me, that bubble shattered on 9/11 in 2001 when I was living in Manhattan. I think I lived in a little bit of a nice utopian bubble on the eve of 9/11. But after 9/11, I felt compelled to become a rabbi. I was an attorney, and I left being a lawyer because I wanted to serve the Jewish people after what I witnessed on 9/11. And I think a lot of us have been lulled perhaps into a feeling of safety and security, which has unfortunately we've been disillusioned this past year. And I want to pray for peace in the year ahead. I mean, we're hitting Rosh Hashanah this week, right? We're going to pray for peace. We want to pray to be inscribed in the book of life. We want to pray to meet people and innocent people on all sides. We want to free them from suffering and pain and harshness. But when you have a Nasrallah in charge, when you have people who are determined to wipe the Israelis off the face of the earth, I think what we've seen in the past week is that we need a forceful response. And there's an old line from a rabbi who says, I'd rather be a part of the state of Israel hated by the world than in Auschwitz loved by it. And that's a very powerful statement, and one I've always been uncomfortable with to a certain extent, because I used to be a peacenik. I am a peacenik. I would love for there to be peace and reconciliation among good and well-meaning people. But there are some times in which we as Jews have to defend ourselves. And that's what we're seeing, and that's giving us a lot of pride.
Well, let's look at this statement by Prime Minister Netanyahu at the UN on Friday, where he tries to bring the world thinking, and particularly America thinking, into how it feels to be in Israel.
Hezbollah is the quintessential terror organization in the world today. It has tentacles that span in all continents. It has murdered more Americans and more Frenchmen than any group except bin Laden. It's murdered the citizens of many countries represented in this room. And it has attacked Israel viciously over the last 20 years. In the last year, completely unprovoked. A day after the Hamas massacre, on October 7th, Hezbollah began attacks against Israel, which forced more than 60,000 Israelis on our northern border to leave their homes, becoming refugees in their own land. Hezbollah turned vibrant towns in the north of Israel into ghost towns. So I want you to think about this in equivalent American terms. Just imagine if terrorists turned El Paso and San Diego into ghost towns. Then ask yourself, how long would the American government tolerate that? A day? A week? A month? I doubt they tolerate it even for a single day. Yet Israel has been tolerating this intolerable situation for nearly a year. Well, I've come here today to say, enough is enough.
That's just really powerful. It's powerful, especially considering what was happening simultaneously as he was giving that speech. And he was not only speaking the words, but the words had action behind them.
Mm-hmm. And it seemed like every argument, you could kind of see through the arguments. There was so much of the attacks against what Israel was doing had to do with collateral damage. So then they do the pagers, where there's no collateral damage. I mean, the most brilliant thing that you could see. And then this, and still, as soon as...
It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how they do it. If they drop bombs, people criticize that there's collateral damage. If they do targeted assassinations, people criticize. There's always criticism around self-defense of the Jewish individual. It is a odd thing. We saw Dara Horn, as you mentioned to me, wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about sort of that anti-Semitism that exists in the Ivy League. Mm-hmm. She wrote a book called People Love Dead Jews. And in that book, she wrote about an instance that happened at the Anne Frank Center, where the Anne Frank Center in Amsterdam asked one of its employees to take off his yarmulke because it was causing offense to people who might be coming into the Anne Frank Museum. A ridiculous idea. But there was something about us, in the title of her book, human beings being drawn to dead Jews like in Anne Frank, while being fundamentally uncomfortable with a religious Jew who is openly religious and who will defend his identity and will be outside of the mainstream of thought and will keep his own or her own dietary restrictions and pray to his or her own God. That is an anathema to some people, because we're not going along with whatever the latest craze might be, whatever the trend might be, whatever the woke mind virus might indicate what it is. We have another operating system, an operating system that comes from the Torah, that comes from our Bible, that we try to see the world through. And some people don't like that. Some people are fundamentally uncomfortable with that. And as a result of that, we have seen, I think, I just saw this just the other day. A friend of mine shared with me. He was on a Facebook page and he was talking about repairing cars. And he asked a question about car repair, and somebody commented saying, well, you are a genocide supporter, so how dare, blah, 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 blah. He said he was just on a page talking about car repairs on Facebook when all of a sudden this vitriol is spouted out at us. I think we're still trying to deal with it. So let me just say, it's the high holidays. And one of the things that we Jews have to do on the high holidays is repent. Mm-hmm. Do a little bit of atonement. Mm-hmm. We're taking these next 10 days or these next 2 weeks to think about, all right, what have we done this past year? Where have we been at fault? Maybe we overreacted. Maybe we didn't handle the situation the right way. We're really focused in on how can we be better people and acknowledge the ways at which we have been wrong. I'm hopeful that maybe if it's so hard to do when you're at war, Sherry. It's so hard to do when you're at war, to be able to acknowledge your limitations, to be able to do the type of atonement that our tradition wants us to do and come clean and say, oh, okay, look, I'm choking on it myself. Okay, we did this wrong. We've been mistaken. I see the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, up there, and I know that there are a lot of people who have been against Netanyahu because they have in their heart of hearts a belief that we can achieve peace. Now, I lived in Jerusalem in 1998. I lived there again in 2005 and 2006, and there was a strong and robust peace movement that wanted to believe that we could achieve reconciliation. What I've been particularly hopeful by in the recent weeks, in terms of what Jared Kushner said, in terms of what Bibi Netanyahu said, is he's talking today to the people of Iran. He says, I'm not against you. We want a flourishing Middle East. Mm-hmm. We want people to be able to speak freely, to be able to enter into entrepreneurship freely. We want to work together. I'm not after you. I'm after, and in a certain way, a liberator of your people from this tyrannical regime that you are a part of. I like that. Uh-huh. I like speaking directly to the people, because I think if I want to say what I've been guilty of this past year, perhaps I have been a little blind to some of the suffering that's been happening. Perhaps my hurt and pain on what happened over October 7th has made it harder for me to acknowledge the hurt and pain on the other side. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I'm working on. And I think hopefully we can begin to do better in the year ahead. Ceasefire is a good word. We would like wars to stop. Mm-hmm. And I think hopefully if we can begin communicating with each other, maybe we can stop the bombs from falling. There we go, Sherry. I sound a little utopian in there, don't I?
And it's been frustrating because in my watching, and correct me, it seemed like this is not Netanyahu from October 8th was saying the best way to end a regional war is to win it.
Yes.
But the U.S. was holding him back and pulling him back and continuing to try to pull him back, and even then complaining that they had nothing to do with his going in and going after Nasrallah. And that I wonder about that in terms of anti-Semitism, and I also wonder about it in the bigger context because of what Netanyahu said and what I've always believed. Israel is kind of the last outpost of the West. This is a war against the West. It's a war against Jews, but it's a war against the West.
And Netanyahu said that he is on the front lines, and that these people, the Nasrallahs of the world, are no friends of America, mm-hmm. And consider an America to be a Satan along with Israel to be a Satan. And so, yeah, to a certain extent, he's out there fighting the war. But, to come back to a point that we heard him talk about earlier, which is the comparison between what Israel tries to do when it fights its war. You mentioned the pagers, trying to limit collateral damage, trying to not indiscriminately bomb, trying to limit to whatever extent possible. You can do that when terrorists are hiding hostages and civilians underneath where they are and where they're shooting from, to try to limit any collateral damage as much as possible. And I think not only the pressure from the United States, but also pressure from a large segment of the Jewish community that wants Israel to be better than other countries because it is a Jewish state. It wants to appeal to the highest possible values. And you have a lot of people who march in Israel and who march in Tel Aviv who want to create a world of peace with their neighbors. And this desire to not just be like other countries, but to actually be a light unto all of the other nations, I think is a large part of what it means to be a Jew. And I think that's why coming to terms with actually winning a war sometimes is hard for us, because that application of brute force sometimes runs counter to our hopes and aspirations.
Right. It's very anti-woke. You know, you get into toxic masculinity when you do it. Even though there is no army that's got more women in it than Israel's probably. But
I named my son Samson because I tell you why. Because sometimes, okay, perfect. This is one of those examples. Sometimes maybe you need a leader for 20 years like a Samson who is masculine and toxically masculine, because for every season there's a season, and sometimes there's a season in which wars just have to be won. And that is the role of Samson. Now, other times you have Esther, Queen Esther, who saves the Jewish people. So it's her toxic femininity and her beauty and her guiles that is the right hero for our people to have at that particular time. But I think you're right. And I think I was going to say unfortunately, we might be in one of those seasons in which we need a toxic masculine leader in the mold of Samson, because this just happens to be where we are at the moment.
Well, yeah, clearly.
I mean, I know before I got here, there were talk of troop movements and ground forces moving up through Lebanon. So we are in the midst of what feels like a regional war, and I think we're beginning to figure out what that means for us as Jews here in Texas as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Texas, and I'm wondering sometimes if it's, we're so tribal in the way that we do things. Houston Mayor John Whitmire, who was the longest-serving legislator before he left to become mayor of Houston, he was pushed in being in Houston to issue a proclamation for ceasefire early on after the attack, the October 7th attack. And he went to the Jewish community and he said, when some of your enemies asked me to issue a proclamation for a ceasefire, I did not respond. And he took a great deal of heat from that. Now the woman who has replaced him, Senator Molly Cook, who was elected in a special election this summer, she said, I cannot stay silent while the United States facilitates the indiscriminate bombing and starvation of an entire population. She called for ceasefire. So this big Senate district, 1 million people in Houston, changed the person that represented them. They changed, and I'm wondering...
Do you think that's representative of Houston politics?
I don't. No, I don't.
So what accounts for it? You would know better than me. What do you think accounts for it?
I think that it's following the lead of Kamala Harris. That and what I know of the Democrats in the state Senate, that the progressive wing of their party, which is sympathetic to the terrorists, demands that you bend the knee to a certain ideology. And I think that's what she did. Whitmire had been there for so long that he was not willing to do it.
There's an excellent piece in The Statesman today by Rabbi Steinman from Temple Beth Shalom here in Austin, and she talks about being a Zionist and being a lesbian rabbi and being ostracized completely from the gay community. Because you, I guess in a similar way to your story, is that progressive wing has made it improper for, and she's not the only one, other members of the gay and lesbian community have come up to me and say when they're in settings they have to hide sometimes their Jewish identity. They have to hide their support for Israel because it is not allowed by the machine or by the party or by whatever it is. And that has led to a chilling, I think, amongst a lot of progressively minded Jews and amongst a lot of gay Jews who feel like they can't represent themselves openly as Jews and as Zionists in settings which have been co-opted by whatever that progressive party line might be.
And even though is there anybody left who has failed to hear the joke about gays for Palestine?
It has to do with some weird sense of intersectionality in which there has to be in all circumstances one perceived oppressor and one perceived oppressee. And they've just grafted that onto every possible circumstances, which is reductio ad absurdum. It ends up being just ridiculous, especially when you apply it to what's going on in the Middle East. And it's a simplistic way of looking at the world. You know, one of the things that Dara Horn mentioned in her article that you shared with me was that even in Harvard, people are still getting their education on TikTok in terms of what is happening in the Middle East. And that she referred to it, she quoted journalist Mati Friedman, who said that it's like referring to World War II as the American-Italian conflict because you have taken everything out of context. You only understand a snapshot of it, and that snapshot can go very viral and can be pushed with algorithms and can feed into a certain sense of mistrust towards those who are perceived to be in power. And if you take a very superficial view of the world, you can see the Jews in Israel as white settler colonialists, which doesn't even fit. It doesn't fit. I shudder to even mention that. But if you can frame the world in that way, it's sad, Sherry. I've lost friends. And it's been hard to communicate across some of these lines. And as we approach a November election, I see more and more friendships breaking down over this, where people are stopped communicating with each other. People believe their own set of narratives and just live in their own separate worlds. And that's too bad, because I think the heart of Judaism and the heart of the high holidays is to be able to sit across from someone like you and I are sitting now and have a conversation. I don't know what you're going to say. You don't know what I'm going to say, but we want to understand each other better so that we can better understand how to live in this world.
Well, how do you do that as a rabbi? Because you can't segregate who you talk to. People have got to come to you with all kinds of worldviews, certainly all kinds of views on the election, all kinds of views on what's going on in Israel. How do you do that?
Amen. Well, I always say, I said this before, like 2014, 2015, I used to say that if heaven forbid this country went into a civil war, you would need Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers both praying together in the same temple on the high holidays, right? That would be the way to solve conflict. For me, my position is politics is downstream from religion. But unfortunately, we've seen in a lot of religious institutions politics being primary and then the religious part being downstream from that. I like to call that a violation of the third commandment. So the third commandment says, do not take the Lord's name in vain. And what you see, unfortunately, is a lot of people who have a political position or someone that they want to vote for, and then they tack on a piece of the Bible in order to support that. Well, that's just making your God fit whatever your politics. Right. I like to say we need a space where we can all come together, we can beat our chest, and we can say, yeah, we've been wrong. Maybe we're too zealous after this happened. Maybe we reacted too vociferously. Maybe we said things that were hurtful to other people, and maybe we made mistakes. So I can lead from that. My job as a rabbi, Sherry, this is funny. My job as a rabbi is often meeting people here in Austin who've had bad experiences with clergy, and I'm often apologizing for that. I do think it's an important thing. And if we can, Democrat, Republican, Independent, maybe, all right, this is really wishful thinking. Maybe we can take a step back and look who we've been. What are the ads we've promoted in the past year? What are the articles we've shared? What are the tweets we've sent out? And say, okay, maybe we've gone too far, and apologize for it. That might lead to some greater reconciliation. So how do I do that as a rabbi? I try to say that God is watching, and God knows if you have actually been real with yourself and you've actually looked inside of your heart to say, hey, here's how I've been at fault. Here how I've contributed to some of the heat and the animosity that exists. And to own that as an individual, because you can't really expect it from someone else unless you own it for yourself first.
Yeah. And that, I think, is what makes it tough, because one of the rules of politics, and I'm political operative too, is never apologize. Never explain, and then what royalty never explain, never apologize.
That's why it's good to keep religion and politics separate if you can.
Right, yeah. Just one line from Dora Horn's asking the question, why is Harvard so full of screaming racists? And that is disappointing. I mean, one of the things that we're doing here in Texas is we've worked very hard to reform curriculums. And, there's been a lot of criticism, about, well, you can't teach the Bible. And we're trying to say, no, the Bible is a Western work. You need these stories. We're not teaching people to be Christians or teaching people to be Jews. We're teaching people that without the Bible, you probably would not have had the Constitution or, the great the foundations of our government.
Yeah, I went to a talk a few years back with Camille Paglia. And she was talking about some of her art students, and she played the song Go Down Moses for them to sort of teach them. And she mentioned that none of her undergrads knew who Moses was. And she was shocked. How can you understand America? How can you understand where you live? How can you understand poetry or art if you have no understanding of who Moses was or what the Bible exists? You lose out on the richness of all of the values and the stories that are embedded in so much of our culture if you don't have that basic understanding of some of the foundational texts of our civilization.
Right. Not just you certainly can't understand American culture, but
That's right.
Culture. It's just incredible. So behind this all is the media.
I'm a journalist kid. My dad,
Really?
my dad went to Columbia Journalism, studied with
gosh.
Fred Friendly back in the late 60s.
gosh.
He worked for the Daily News and the New York Times and Jewish newspapers. He broke his leg. Dad, speedy recovery to you. I'm sure you're watching. But he still is a journalist. And for him, I grew up with, just the facts. Just give me the facts. Play it straight. Be objective. I found this frustrating as a son of a reporter because I always wanted him to take a side, but he was so imbued with that journalistic ethics to be impartial and to be objective. And that is gone. That is non-existent in our world today. And I was just talking with my 10-year-old son who was interested in politics, Gewalt, and he wants to know what news channel I'm watching to follow some of the stories that we've talked. And he comes in and I say, okay, well, now I'm watching this channel because I want to see what the Arab point of view is. So I'm watching Al Jazeera, or now I'm watching Israeli news because I want to see what the Israeli point of view is. And now I'm watching Fox News, and now I'm watching CNN. And I have to explain to him what it means to consume media, because you have to understand the implicit biases, or maybe not so implicit, some of the biases that are being carried. And at the same time, just beginning to navigate all of the media requires that awareness. And so maybe that's something we should think about teaching in our schools, which is to how to navigate media in the world. I think perhaps that would be a good lesson for them to have in the Ivy Leagues.
Yeah, I think they are really shameless. I read a very long story yesterday in the New York Times kind of going through the last 72 hours. And essentially its thesis, as I said, was that the risk, the risk that Netanyahu was taking was that he would be provoking Hezbollah, as if they hadn't already.
Right, as if they haven't spit out. Somebody, I forget who quoted this, and I hate to quote it out of hand, but somebody said, it's like saying killing Osama bin Laden would escalate the circumstance, right? It's just, it's arguments like that I think they strain credulity for us. And yeah, it becomes hard. So it's just what I teach my son is I be able to spot who's talking, be able to understand where they're coming from, be able, if you can, to sympathize and be compassionate to their point of view, and also understand when there are slanting things in order to fit the narrative that they have. And my son's 10. But I don't know how else to do it. It's not like when my dad was just the facts.
Almost ready for Harvard. Well, one more thing I wanted to ask you about is that when we talked in last year, shortly after the attacks, you couldn't tell it in the media, but support for Israel was at about 80%.
Yep.
And now it's kind of it's closer to 60 because of the ongoing onslaught of misinformation and slanted information from the media. What do you think will happen now? I know that Likud is their favorabilities are much higher, as you said.
Sure.
Netanyahu's favorabilities are higher, but I don't know how that will play in the U.S. and how it'll play in Texas.
I don't know how it will play in Texas either. But I was comforted because I saw that the governor put out a proclamation just this morning for October 7th calling for a moment of silence in the state of Texas, asserting that anti-Semitism will have no place here in Texas. We moved from California, as you know, as we discussed a couple of years ago. It's comforting to know that you have leadership here in the State House that is going to care about the safety and the security of Jewish people and is going to fight anti-Semitism. I think that's important. Now, I think I want to say two things.
Okay.
One, the first thing I want to say is we Jews shouldn't care too much about popularity polls. Okay. I think we have to defend ourselves. What we might have to say and teach and speak might not be in line with conventional wisdom of the day. It might not be fitting in with the morality of the times, but it's connected to the morality as our Jewish people have understood it for 3,000 years. And so if it's unpopular for time to time, okay, we have to stomach up and perhaps not being the most popular in the world. The other part is we haven't been perfect. We've made mistakes, or maybe we've advocated in the wrong way. We've been too harsh. And I think taking the next couple of weeks with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to think about how we communicating to the people of Texas who we are, trying to be an ally for them and asking for them to be in allyship with us, and maybe acknowledging the ways in which we could do better. I think maybe that might help us garner the support, as opposed to shouting and yelling at people and telling them wrong, which perhaps leads to the diminishment of the popularity from 80% to 60%.
And for people who aren't Jews and who haven't been to Israel and didn't live in New York like I did, for whom this is a community that they're not around, what do they need to do to understand why this is such a big issue? And not just another foreign war.
I would say, wow, how do they need to know it's a big issue and not just another foreign war? What a question, Sherry. I think most helpful would be to sit and to try to listen. If they could listen, if they could go into Jewish dialogues, to be in Jewish spaces, to try to engage with their Jewish neighbors, to try to better understand why this has hit us particularly hard, to understand maybe a little bit about some of the difficulties the Jewish people have endured over thousands of years, maybe to understand how this can be something, what's going on now that can really reflect in a large way some of the negative experience that the Jews have been subjected to for thousands of years. If they perhaps might be willing to enter into a conversation around that, that would be helpful. How is it not just another war? Well, I think you have people who are against civilization. You're against people who are against Jewish ethics, who are against Christian ethics, who are against freedom, who are against free speech, who are against rights of minorities, who are against women's rights, and who are trying to eliminate a democratic state, the only democratic state in the Middle East, can perhaps get us to think about some of the freedoms that we hold so valuable that we hold of such value here in Texas, like our freedom of speech, like our freedom of association, like our freedom of religion. The state of Israel is fighting for those values this very day, and trying to articulate that and express it in a way that people can find common cause would be my blessing for the year ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to talk to you.
Yeah.
I could go on for another hour.
Well, thanks for making the time. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Can you say Good Yuntif? Is it too early for that?
You can say Good Yontif. You can say Shana Tova. Good Yontif is Yiddish, so you should have a good Yom Tov. You should have a good holiday.
Okay.
So you can say Good Yontif or you can say Shana Tova, which
Shana
means
Tova.
Happy New Year. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So we're set. We're
Amen.
set. Thank you for joining me. Thank you all for joining us. You can subscribe to the Sherry Sylvester Show at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Sylvester1630. And if you'd like to receive the 9th in Congress newsletter, you can sign up at TPPF website, www.texaspolicy.com, 9th in Congress. See you next time.